Hello and welcome to Risk at Work, RiskConnect's educational web series. I'm Scott Fenstermaker, I'm VP of Digital Marketing. Today we're talking about geopolitical and economic risks associated with national elections. It's a wonderful topic to be talking about right now, not just in the US, but globally. It has seemed that election outcomes within perhaps the last 5 or 10 years have been starting to introduce much more volatility in terms of policy and in terms of international relations than they have in the previous time period. And this has many, many ramifications for business, perhaps not all of which are being considered as much as they should. When we think about international relations, we tend to first think about supply chain. But now is the time to be expending some imagination, thinking beyond the realms of supply chain into the things that can happen between simple supply chain disruptions on the one hand and outright nationalization on the other. There are a lot of things that can happen to our businesses, especially as we are global businesses and trading globally, that are on the route between severity and minor disruption. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We have a wonderful guest to talk about that. First, a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, if you have a question for our guest, please put it into the question field of your webinar software. If we do not answer that question during the course of the talk today, we will email you directly with an answer to your question. Also, if you've indicated that you would like CPE credit for attending our webinar today, please watch your inbox after we're done. We're going to send you a short quiz with 3 questions. You fill it out, you send it back to us, and we will reply to you with your CPE credit. All right, we get to welcome back today a friend of Risk at Work. He has previously held executive roles such as Chief Audit Executive, Chief Risk Officer, and Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer. He is the author of Risk-Based Internal Auditing and also a contributing author of OSIG GRC Capability Model version 3 and Sawyer's International Auditing versus version 7. He is the host of several podcasts, including the top-ranked Jammin' with Jason. You know him from Risk at Work. Help me welcome back Jason Mefford. Jason, how are you doing today?
Cue the applause, right?
Cue the
Ha,
applause!
yes, yay,
I,
yay.
That's the one bad thing is that we can't hear, we're not live in front of an audience, so we can't hear the massive applause that we would
Exactly,
get as soon as I tee you up. But
exactly.
I certainly will applaud you, and thank you very much for coming back and being with us. As always, we love to hear from you.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to be here because I think, again, this is the last really 20, 25 years of elections have just been crazy all over the world,
Yeah.
here in the US and other places as well. And I think it's just highlighting a lot of things that maybe we took for granted a little bit. Sometimes I think in our risk management we get a little short-sighted and just think about the last quarter, last couple of years, last 5 or 10 years. But some of these things go back, maybe even more than that. Because I know, like last year at Connect, it was one of my sessions there was about historical risks that are popping up again, and I think this is
Hmm.
one. So I guess we better jump in, and I'm sure that the first question everybody is having from the title is who's going to win the election, right?
Right.
What should I do?
Yeah.
So, okay, everybody, I'm sorry for those of you that showed up today. We might disappoint you a little bit because this is going to be politically agnostic. We're not going to predict the election. It's too close to call, as everybody's saying anyway, and that's not really the purpose of this, right? It's to help you think and prepare your organization for regardless of who wins the election, but just realize some of the things that could happen or some of the effects and impacts that you need to be prepared for. If you want to look at, because part of it we were looking at maybe before, and we're not going to go into it, but there's a whole bunch of data out there about incumbent parties after the election, what happens to the economy versus somebody that comes in from the outside. You can go look all that up if you want to, and you can try to read the tea leaves there. But I think one of the main messages, and we're going to go through and start talking about what some of these main messages are, but really prepare for resiliency. Okay. And I have 2000 and 2020 up there. And at least here in the US, those are two national elections 20 years apart that caused a huge amount of disruption in this country, right? If you remember, again, some of you may not be old enough to remember the whole hanging Chad sort of thing from the 2000 election, but I think it was clear into January or February of the following year before they actually called that election, right? And so that put a lot of the world on hold of who's going to be our president, Bush or Gore, right? You fast forward to 2020, again, we had some contested results. We had, people marching on Washington and all kinds of other stuff that were going on. So some disruptions, right? And again, we can't necessarily predict what the volatile events are going to be exactly, but you can prepare for the impacts. And that's where, again, it's, the better you are from a resiliency perspective, the better off you're going to be regardless of what actually happens. So no, we're not gonna call the election here. Who knows when it'll actually be called, right? But let's jump in and talk about some of the main things that we want to go through today. And the first one is a reminder that geopolitical becomes economic and economic becomes geopolitical. And I think that is it's a very basic concept, but I think sometimes we forget it, right? That politics are driven by economics, but economics also drive politics, right? They're a symbiotic relationship. And so, we need to really kind of understand and dig in a little bit and try to understand exactly what is going on. And it makes sense. Okay. I mean, there's a James Carville, who was Bill Clinton's one of his advisors, was famous for saying, "It's the economy, stupid," right? Of when trying to look at who was going to win the election, and a lot of times it comes down to how do people feel, right? Do they feel like they're better off or worse off than they were 4 years ago, as an example? So there is this huge coupling between these two that when you start to look at it, you can start to see some of these things. Okay. The next thing is we're going to talk a little bit about adjusting your process for decision making. And the reason for that is I know everybody thinks we've got so much more data, we've got so much more information, we're making better decisions. But there may be some things that you should be considering on that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Because we see this in not just in business but in politics and everything else too, which gets us to the can you trust the data, which is again, I think a lot of times we end up kind of going through a hypnotic trance thinking that we've got plenty of data, and so we're making decisions just purely on the data. But I've got some questions for you to ask about the data later on to make sure, can you actually trust the data? Is it good data, right? And is it telling you what you think it's telling you? Because at the end of the day, there's more volatility in the world in general. I mean, we've talked about that on, you know, webinars I've been on. I'm sure other people have as well. That there's just a lot more volatility in the world. And sometimes when little things happen, they have a huge spike, right? And so, because of that, again, the more resilient you can be, the better prepared you're going to be when this volatility happens. Now, I know we're risk managers, and so, we think volatility is bad. But volatility can also be very good too if we're actually making the right decisions, right? Because volatility makes people rich. It also makes people very poor because there's a huge shift in economic power when these things end up happening. So
I want to before you move off this slide, you've said several things here quickly that are worthy of highlighting. I wanted to highlight just one up there because I think it deserves explanation. I know you're going to talk about this a little bit later, but the first one you said where the geopolitical becomes economic and the economic becomes geopolitical. First thing that came to my mind when you said that was the Brexit referendum. I think that that's possibly a very good example to start with. You and I were talking offline about this, where um, one of the elements of potential complacency with us as organizations and with us as risk managers is we'll tend to believe that everybody is subscribes to rational actor theory, right? Everybody is going to act in their rational best interests, right? And if you take a look at the dynamics of the Brexit vote, most of the rhetoric around the decision to leave the EU was not at all economic. It was economic in a way, but it had overtones of identity and nationalism and a lot of other things that were the real predicate cause for that. So that's an example of a very extreme example of um, something that would ordinarily be a political concern having enormous economic ramifications. I think that there were many banks that relocated out of London, previously the banking capital of Europe, as a result of that, for example, not to even mention the trade barriers that went up with Europe and so forth. So these things, when we as risk managers, but when risk managers contemplate these things, I see a lot of a contemplation of the economic away from the geopolitical, right? Are you ready for an economic risk? Yeah, we're ready for a recession. Are you ready for a geopolitical risk? Yeah, we're ready for supply chain disruption. But very little precognizance, I think, of these things affecting one another. Is that your experience too? And what's your reflection on that?
Yeah, it is. I think people like to separate the two and think that they're separate, but they're
Mm-hmm.
not. Right. In fact, like you said, and a lot of the rhetoric that we hear in the data, right, because media is data, that we're going to get into a little bit later, is, I think sometimes we like to believe the rhetoric. And so, like if we take Brexit as an example, it was very impassioned, right? There was a lot of nationalism and isolationism, if you will. I mean, come on. The UK fought how many world wars in Europe, right? I mean, this goes back centuries as well,
Mm-hmm.
right? But in order to get people to vote a certain way, they impassion them and use some of these non-rational decision making, right, to get people to vote a certain way. And so we can look at it as purely a geopolitical thing, but don't don't be fooled into thinking that somebody didn't profit from that, right? I know it was a big deal. A lot of banks and other things, had to move outside of the UK for certain reasons. There were some different things that needed to be done, but somebody profited from it because usually political agendas are driven by underlying economics that most of us just don't know what the economics are.
Mm-hmm.
And we can see that now even, with some of the hot spots around the world and other things like that too. We'd like to think that it's only, this group of people not liking this group of people, and that's why they're choosing to fight. But there's always some economic drive behind it too.
Sure.
And so I don't think, while we would like to believe that the world is nice and black and white, and we can say, geopolitical risk over here, we're going to segregate that economic risk over here, right? And so now but you have to, and this is that whole idea of interconnected risks that we've been talking a lot about too, is you can't just isolate these things. You got to realize that they are connected in some way or another.
All right. Forgive the digression. Please carry on.
No, no, no. It's because I think it's an important, and one of the main points that we wanted to make with people is, you can't just consider all these things mutually exclusive because they're not, right?
Right.
And the more you dig into it and the more you look, then you can start to kind of understand maybe some of the things that are happening. Um, but let's jump in, because again, we only have an
Yep.
hour. I wish we had like
Let's
five
let yeah.
hours, 5 hours,
By all means.
5 hours that we could go through this. But like I said, there's more volatility, there's bigger tails as well, right?
Yep.
And some people like big tails, some people don't like big tails, right? Because it's like I said, there's volatility makes people rich. Volatility also makes people poor. It depends on which side of that coin you happen to be on. It's that classic risk and reward, opportunity and threat kind of thing that we've talked a lot about before. But why is this happening? One of the reasons is fewer people are making the decisions, and so there's more inequality. And I know a lot of you listening to this are going to say, but DEI, and we're a more inclusive society, right? No, actually, we're not. Because a lot of the people who are making these big decisions, fewer and fewer people are making the decisions in government, in business, all the way around. Fewer people are involved, right? Larger monopolistic companies have a much bigger impact on the economy than before, when everything was, little and mid-sized companies all kind of working together, right? So concentration in the size of organizations in their sphere of influence makes a big difference, right? Government and the government reach, and the fact that, even like in America, we've got the three branches of government in order to be a check and balance, but you can go back and look at, and it's everybody does this, how much stuff is done through executive order now instead of actually going through the whole congressional process, right? And so you've got fewer people that are making more of the decisions. You've also got less critical thinking. And again, I know a lot of you are going to be like, "What? No, this can't be," right? But I can show, we don't have time all today to go through this, but I will tell you, I was surprised too at first, but I've done a bunch of research, and the number one skills gap in internal audit, right, which is very closely akin to risk management, is critical thinking. Almost every chief audit executive that I talk to, their people are not thinking as critically as they would like them to. Now, why does that happen? Well, a lot of it is because we believe what we think are the facts, right? We go into a Google search, we look up, something online, usually is how we look at everything now. And we tend to take the answer that we're given without really pushing back as much. So we've become a much more compliant society, and there's less critical thinking. Now, there's also unintended consequences of some of these decisions. And so, one example is tariffs. That on the one hand, people look at it and say, well, we're doing this. Why are we doing this? Well, we're doing it to protect our national interest, right? But are they really, right? Because tariffs have unintended consequences, and all countries are doing this. It's not just the US, but obviously I'm more familiar with it, and most of you are probably from here. But, adding tariffs to, goods from China, let's say, it's supposed to, or at least the rhetoric is that it protects US jobs, but it also makes goods consumed in the US more expensive, significantly more expensive, right? Like some of the tariffs are 100%. Well, that means the raw cost, right, to the company in the US selling that good from China now costs them twice what it used to. Who pays for it? Well, the little guy pays for it.
I want to jump in on that because that's obviously self-evidently true. Tariffs are one of these things that have come back in fashion, as it were, in the past 10 years. This is an example, a very good example of the increased volatility that you were just talking about. In a space of global free trade, it doesn't make a lot of sense to start increasing tariffs because of exactly what you said, because it's an automatic price increase for consumers. And that's the pressure that has kept tariffs, I think, away for 20, 30 years since global free trade was more or less introduced. But they're coming back, and not just in the U.S.
Yeah, all
Chinese
over
have
the world.
imposed tariffs. Modi in India is becoming more protectionist, and so these things get introduced again for reasons that are not entirely economic. These are more introduced for political reasons, and you have and another example of people acting perhaps not inside their economic interests, but for other interests, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think it's one of these that shows why volatility. Again, tariffs are something that usually are, again, smaller number of people making the decisions, right? It's not
Yeah,
like they go to Congress and debate this,
right.
right, for a year. No, somebody in an administrative bureaucratic situation and the president kind of sign off on it and say, boom, here you go. And so for companies that are importing from some of these countries that face tariffs or could face tariffs, the volatility is all of a sudden, like literally overnight, your costs can double. And it's difficult for a business to do that. I mean, I've experienced that myself in my own little business, right? I've had some costs that have doubled in the last year because of inflation and people
Hmm.
raising their prices. Well, you have to pass that on. Can you pass it on? Right. So there's unintended consequences. Now, what we're also seeing too is concentration of data and concentration of media. And again, you don't have to believe me. You can go do your research on this, but about six companies control about 90% of the media in the US. Okay. And data, right? We're not just talking about news media and that kind of stuff, but data companies as well are concentrating. And so, again, it's like the data is being held by fewer and fewer people, which again is okay, right? And I'm not suggesting anything nefarious, but when you have fewer and fewer sources to go to for information or for data, you have to start asking yourself, is that data actually still clean, or could somebody be manipulating it on the backside, right? And I think we're going to see some of that coming out because there's fewer independent sources. In the old days, from a media perspective, you used to have a bunch of investigative journalists that were out there that were all investigating, and then sometimes the different media sources would come up with different information because they would find things or they would see things in a different way. You don't see that anymore, right? One of the media consolidations has been to get rid of investigative journalism. And so,
Yeah.
you don't see some of that stuff. Is that going to carry over into our data as well? Don't know, right? But something to consider. And I learned this early on as a young man, that the headlines don't actually match the reality. And so, in a previous life, I actually worked in the Idaho State Senate. And the year that I was there, it was a very controversial. There was some bills that were going through the Idaho Senate that actually had national prominence. Okay. So the national media was coming into Boise, doing all these things. People from all over the country were coming in to have these rallies and speeches and everything else. And I would sit in committee meetings and I would go and I would watch some of these people talk. And I learned very quick, I do my work and then I come home and I watch the news. And they'd be talking about a committee meeting that I was sitting in. I was in this committee meeting for hours and I would hear them report on what happened in the meeting. And I was like, I was in that meeting. That's not actually what happened. Right. So as a young man, I was seeing this. And one thing that really punctuated it was, it was a big rally. There were people on the state steps, and different people were coming up and giving their speeches and rah, rah, rah. Everybody was out in the crowd. It was both sides. They would kind of take turns. And so the media was there, and I would watch as the cameras would go up under the cameraman's shoulder. They would take film, somebody would switch, different person comes up, they drop their camera. And I'm like, this is interesting. So I watched this for a little while, and one of my sister's roommates from college happened to be a local reporter. And so I saw her and her camera crew, and they were doing the same thing. They were lifting it up, dropping it down. And so I went over to her and I'm like, I'm just curious. Why did you guys not even roll footage on this person's speech? And she kind of gave some answer and I kind of pushed a little bit because I was a young guy. I didn't know to be tactful at that point as much. And she really kind of shut me down. And so I go home at the end of the day and the phone rings and it's her. And she says, I wanted to apologize and maybe explain what happened today. And I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, well, my crew was there, and so I couldn't tell you what I actually think, but we have been told by our editors to get certain sound bites to make a certain story, right? For me. Now, this is long before fake news. This is 35, 40 years ago, okay, when this was still going on, even at that point. So it's not a surprise now, again, a lot of times the headlines don't match the reality. That goes back to the can we trust the data, right? Or is somebody trying to spin a particular story because of rhetoric or other things that they want to do? And what really is the economics behind it, right? And so this is what we're talking about. Anytime that you concentrate decision making and you concentrate data in the hands of a few people, there is the potential for those people to misuse it, right? And so again, we're going to get into a little bit more about how as organizations you can kind of help switch that around a little bit too, knowing that this is probably the case so that you're making better decisions as well. Okay. Now, we
Very
talked
good.
before about energy and money, 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 right? And again, some of you may be falling on deaf ears, and that's okay. But there is huge from a supply chain standpoint, things are going on in the world about energy and money right now. And again, it's a concentration, just like we talked about before, of, energy and money are controlled at a much more concentrated rate than they ever have been before. And so the first one to kind of think about is the money supply. And again, I'm going to let you go do your own research on some of this stuff, but uh, some different things that have come up around brick and Swift and this whole digital reset idea. And I think we were even, kind of referring, I can't remember if it was off camera or on camera a little bit, about like Brexit and some of these other different things that are going on from a money perspective. But now it is, and again, why this matters from a risk management and a resiliency perspective is literally a flip can get switched now in the digital economy and money goes away. Literally money goes away or you can't touch it. And so we've had this example of RICO in the US for a long time, which is racketeering and something else.
Hmm.
It's a business law that the US government usually uses for people that they don't like, bad people, criminals, other people like that, that if they believe that you're in a criminal conspiracy, they will flip the switch and they will freeze all of your assets. And it happens literally like with the flip of a switch. So that ability exists. And again, I'm not saying people are going to use it, but there's the potential for that. And we have had certain things like Swift, which is a banking way to settle monies around the world. Well, that's shut off for certain countries now because of some of these different things that are going on, the nationalism, and now we don't like this group of people, and now we like this group of people instead. And so you've seen that whole countries are kind of off from a money supply perspective. So that could be, both sides. It could be your customers, it could be your employees, it could be your supply chain as well, right? But just to think about it. And there's a lot of things going on in a macro geopolitical issue like BRIC, right, which stood for Brazil, Russia, India, China, that were started by those four countries as a way to try to get around some of the international settlement. And we've got things like petrodollar and some other things that people are talking about. And they're going back and forth, but just keep your eye on it, right? We've got energy issues, right? We got a big power line on the slide right here. And again, we probably take for granted, right? We take for granted that we're going to flip the switch and the lights are going to go on. But there's certain places in the world where that doesn't happen, right? And again, we kind of say, well, that's just infrastructure issues, right? They just have poor infrastructure. We don't have that risk here in the US. Unless if you've been in a place that has brownouts and blackouts and places like Houston, where some of the people after some of the flooding were out of power for over 2 weeks, right? Now there's obviously that standard resiliency side of it, but then there's also some things to consider, which is we're using a tremendous amount of energy. And every research that I've seen, we do not have enough power. In fact, within a few years, if we don't do something, we're going to run out of power. So, what's causing this? AI is a huge drain on electricity. So is crypto, right? I mean, huge drain on electricity. And so, since we don't have enough energy to run a lot of the things that we need to, countries are now actually switching back on some of the nuclear capability because they know that there's no way that we can actually make up for it without doing something like this. And again, you might say, well, what are you talking about? Right. Well, 3 Mile Island that had a huge, a nuclear disaster, many years ago, it's coming back online. And why is it coming online? Specifically to power AI data centers, right? Government spending billions of dollars. Another one in Michigan. I mean, this is going to be happening everywhere, right? And so some of these things are going to be coming as well. And when you consider, again, in a stable place like the US that these things are going on, in a lot of these hot spots around the world too, what are the targets militarily? Their infrastructure, their energy, right? A lot of news sources out of the Ukraine Russia issue. Ukraine is now a net importer of electricity, right? Because their infrastructure has been damaged. Now, again, you can say, well, that's Ukraine, that's Europe, right? But what happens in part of Europe ends up trickling into the rest of Europe. And while you might say, well, I don't have anything in Russia or Ukraine, well, do you have any operations or any customers or any supply chain in Europe? Because Europe is at risk as well, for some of these things. So again, I think these are a couple of the big areas, and this is just from a resiliency standpoint, right, for us to kind of consider. And a lot of these things again are geopolitical, but they're also economic, right? Um, Another thing, for you to kind of consider is rule of law, which again, I think, was kind of alluded to before of, we can go from, completely free trade kind of stuff down to complete nationalization of assets, which has happened, right? And this is, again, it's a difficult thing to know exactly what is going to happen um, because uh, regimes change, rules of law change. And so, again, it's one of those where I think our focus has been on looking at maybe the last 20, 50, 80 years since the Second World War and assuming that, well, this is the way the world is always going to be now. We're always going to have free trade. We're going to have, World Trade Organization. Okay, but look at some of those organizations and how they're hanging together, and some people are leaving, and other things like this. So, what really is the rule of law in some of the areas where you're working? Because we do see regime changes. I think we were talking before, I think, about Brazil, right?
Hmm.
Again,
Yeah.
where there's been some different government changes, but again, Latin America in particular, those regimes change often fairly quickly, right?
Yep, we're talking right now. There may be companies in the energy sector that have dealings with Venezuela, for example, and there was just more than a contested election, what the international community largely views as an illegitimate reelection of Maduro in Venezuela, right? So I want to emphasize rule of law as you're talking about this, because I think that I remember when globalization was becoming very hot at the late 90s and early 2000s, and I think that the calculus at the time that went through leaders' minds was, what's the with regard to risk, what's the probability that such and such a regime would ever nationalize our assets? And that was basically it, right? If we make direct foreign investment into a particular country, what are the odds that they would completely nationalize us, especially, with regard to China and so forth? And if that was permissible, then direct foreign investment was permissible, and so forth, where our assets are generally safe and so forth. And I think one of the things that you're highlighting here, particularly with rule of law, is there are a lot of things that somebody can do to you south of nationalizing your assets completely, that might be correlated with how much track record a certain regime would have in respecting the rule of law. With regard to property law, for example, with regard to regulation, for example, with regard to permissive or impermissive relationships with government leaders, for example. Um, we might see, and I love your reflection on this, but we might see a revisiting of certain principles that we may have thought were old-fashioned in the past, of track record of respecting property law, track record of peaceful transition of power, as more stringent prerequisites for foreign investment and for trade going forward, because these are the indicators of relative stability going forward. I'd love to get your kind of thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I mean we've seen this in other different areas because, like you said, it's not most likely you're probably not going to have your assets completely nationalized, but it does happen. It has happened. I mean, we've seen this in certain countries around the world, but they can be other things too. Like I used to travel to Western Africa quite a bit for doing training, and I remember, I think it was Nigeria in particular. There were certain workforce laws that required a certain number of local employees for every one expat.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't seem like a big deal, right? Except it was a 7-to-1 ratio. And so I was talking to some of these people, and they're like, yeah, we have a whole bunch of people on our payroll that we have to pay every month, and they never show up to work, right? Because that's one of those rule of law issues. If we're going to do business in this particular country, then we have to do that, right? And so again, that's is it nationalization? No, but it increases your cost significantly
Sure.
of doing business in some of those places. And again, it's one of those kinds of decisions that are usually made by smaller groups of people or one person, right? It's
Right.
not like these things are openly debated. National elections are done through the parliament or Congress of the particular area. No, these are things that are just done, right? And rule of law, we've known for a long time. And why is there so much bribery and corruption in the world? Why does there continue to be so much bribery and corruption in the world? Even though we're not supposed to do it and it's under the radar, it still happens all the time. It's to
Sure.
protect rule of law, right? Because you're paying off judges, you're paying off other officials to help you run your business the way that you need to, right? Not saying anybody on this call is doing that at your company, but it's to try to help protect some of those things, but those can always turn on you as well. Right. And so there is, I think, like you said, that we've got this idea of everybody's going to get along and we're going to love each other and everybody's going to make rational decisions that are in everybody's best interest, but that doesn't always happen. And specifically, governments and other groups have gone against particular companies just because they don't like you. And they find some excuse, they find some rule of law that helps to, perpetuate or make it difficult for these companies. So again,
I,
just something to prepare for.
yeah,
Yeah.
small difference in what I think when you say protect rule of law, you meant to say protect how laws are applied to you. Rule of law would just
Yes.
be the term
Yes.
for an ideal of law applied to everybody equally. So I want to make sure that we're
No, no, no.
not saying that
That's a very good
bribery enforces
clarification.
the rule of law. It's the exact opposite of that. But yeah, let's forgive the
Well,
digression again.
it is and it isn't because again, thanks for the correction because what I was referring to was the indiscriminate,
There it is.
right? And
Yeah.
trying to make sure that there's no indiscriminate. But rule
Capricious
of law,
application. Yeah, exactly.
capricious application to you, but rule of law is also impacted by some of those things. I mean, what's lobbying when you really come down to it?
Right.
It's a way to try to influence the rule of law as well. And again, it's just whether or not people are going to actually follow it. I mean, you made reference to the Venezuelan election. Again, rule of law would say, hey, we have a free election, people vote, we add up the votes, whoever gets the most votes wins. Well, sometimes that's not the case, right? Because the rule of law is not applied if it doesn't uh, help someone's interest,
Yeah.
right? And so sometimes there are discriminate applications of the rule of law. um, yeah. Anyway, when making
Certainly.
think to go down another rabbit hole, but we gotta stick on time.
Let's get going. Yeah,
We
got
gotta stay
about
focused
20
here.
minutes left, about
Yeah,
18
we
minutes
gotta
left.
we gotta stay focused on this. So another one, for you to think about, and again, I think as we talk about resiliency and supply chain, I think workforce is another one that often it doesn't get neglected, but we only think of it as the physical security of our people. If an earthquake happens during working hours, what do we do? Do we evacuate? Do we not? Do we have food in case people have to stay there? Those kinds of
Yeah.
things. But it's also, about where is your workforce distributed? Where are they at in the world? What's the rule of law where they're at, right? And I think I shared on a previous one about an Israeli company that I did some work with who a lot of their developers were in Ukraine and Belarus. Well, now all of a sudden, when that conflict starts, they have to figure out what are they going to do with their workforce, right? And I said it's an Israeli company, so not only did they have workforce issues there, but then they had things going on in their own home country as well. How can we continue to do business if we don't have access to our workforce? Are we able to pay people, right? Because that's the same thing. If you go back up to the money, if we have employees in a particular country, let's say, and all of a sudden the money supply gets shut off, can you still pay them? Can you still have them as employees? Do you need to repatriate them, somewhere? Do you have to do something else different? And so again, it's not just for you to start kind of thinking about, what you can do or think about to be more resilient from your workforce standpoint. Who you can do business with. Again, this is some of it goes back to the, certain people end up on a naughty list. And if you're on the naughty list, then you can't do business with them. Right. And I know Let's talk about this more at Connect too, when we're doing the third party discussion with the executives. But I lived this as an issue where after the September 11th issues, guess what? One of our creditors, one of our lenders, ended up on the naughty list. And all of a sudden, we had to scramble to come up with and replace the funding because we were no longer allowed to do business with this company because it wasn't even a direct thing, but it was one of these where it was like fourth or fifth thing down, and somebody in the administration put them on the naughty list, and so we had to do something different about it, right? Um, we've also got concentration of organizations. And if any of you, if it's around lunchtime, we're going to talk about French fries for a minute. Right? Is when organizational concentration happens, you have to kind of start thinking about how you do things different as well. So, as an example, in one of my companies, we supplied about 40% of all the potato products in the U.S. 100% to McDonald's in Australia. So 100% of all the potato products that were coming out of McDonald's in Australia were from our company.
Mhm.
And so McDonald's, again, from a concentration risk standpoint, said, well, it's probably not good to have sole source providers. We need to do something different. They came up with a policy difference and decided that, well, no one company can represent more than 50% of any particular product, right? Okay.
Sure.
If you can do that, great. Some products you can't do that. There's certain things that there is such a concentration that you only have one or two choices in the world to get certain products from. But in this one, there were others. And so what ended up happening is we gave up, right, 50%, but we took it from somebody else, right?
Mhm.
Because they didn't have the capacity to do both. And so all that ended up happening was a swapping and a switching around,
Right.
right? At the end of the day, but it's still a disruption from a business perspective, right? And so again, things to think about if there's concentrations in your supply chain, concentrations maybe in who you're buying from, but on the flip side, who you're selling to, or some of these other things for you to just kind of be considering. And why again? Because geopolitical ends up affecting some of these things. Because if somebody ends up on the naughty list because of some geopolitical reason, all of a sudden that's going to start affecting you from an economic perspective as well. Uh, and then kind of finally on this one, is this whole idea of dividing up the world in that it's similar to what I was talking about from a French fry perspective, but while we would like to believe that the world is coming together and we're dropping all of these prejudices and we're dropping all of these other things and we're having peace in the world. I mean, my favorite song is Imagine from John Lennon, which that's the whole picture that's trying to paint. But, the reality is at least that may not be able to happen as quickly as we would like to, or we're going to kind of go in this ebb and flow back and forth and back and forth. And so it appears from a lot of the things that are going on, the nationalistic feel that is going on in a lot of places in the world. And because of that, it kind of divides up the world, where you used to be able to, for the most part, have free trade or somewhat free trade or be able to do business with most countries in the world. That's not the case anymore. And if we move into, full scale war again, then that's really going to limit parts of the world that are just going to be off limits. And sometimes that's okay, right? I mean, sometimes you kind of go into it knowing it. I mean, for me as an example, I don't sell much into China because I don't speak Chinese, right? But I know that, right? And I'm okay with that. But as you start looking at your company, are there things like that, or are there things where as the world gets divided up, it may have a significant impact on your ability to do business the way you've been doing it. Right. So some things to think about there. So spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, right? So what can you do about this? Because I've kind of painted a picture, but what can you actually do from your organization perspective? Um, Find reliable media and data sources for you, right? Because I think this is what's important is uh, the right data source, the right media source for you may be different than it is for somebody else. And that's okay, right? But you need to find something that is reliable. Now, how do you know if it's reliable? Well, you got to use it and you got to kind of test it against what actually happens in the future to see, is there a correlation like we thought there was? Is the data giving us apples or is it giving us oranges when we wanted apples? Right. And the only way to know is to actually, go through, start tracking kind of the results from the decisions that you were making based on that data. And so this kind of gets into the decision making too, right? So consider independent and non-traditional sources as well. And I think I've talked a little bit about that before, with there being a concentration, um, what's actually going on. And I'm going to use a crazy example for everybody here, okay? But let's say, somebody had kind of used this analogy to me in the past, which I thought was kind of interesting, is, you can read if I go to an old newsstand, right, which they don't really exist anymore because everything's digital, but I like to go to the newsstands in the old days, right? So you got like Newsweek and Life magazine and The Economist and who knows, right? All these different magazines that are up there, all these different traditional media sources, and then you have the National Enquirer. Okay. Now, I'm not telling you that what's in the National Enquirer is true, but maybe more of it is true than we give it credit for. And what if, again, I'm not telling you to believe it, but if you've got five traditional sources of data or media, what if you throw in one or two non-traditional that might even seem a little bit crazy? I'm not telling you to believe it. I'm not telling you to make decisions on it. But when you line those things up together, does it give you a different picture than if you're only relying on a few, right? Um, right. Now, we want to increase the people providing oversight for the decision making as well. So, again, we're talking about in your organization, right? Because at the beginning, we told you that, look, there's a lot of things that are going on where few people are making the decision. And anytime that few people are making the decision, it's not as good of a decision as if you have different viewpoints. So, can we start having some better decision making by having, more people involved in it, at least to play devil's advocate, we'll say, in things like, including ERM or GRC in strategic discussions, right? Are you getting included in some of these things? It's not that you're going to be the one that makes a decision, but maybe there's a perspective that you can provide that nobody else in the room would hear if you weren't there. But on the flip side, right, when you're doing your risk assessment, is it just you or are you including other people who may have a different viewpoint than you do, right? Which again is good because the more viewpoints that we have, the more data points we have, the easier it is for us to actually make a good decision. And so I'm gonna share with you a couple of practical things here as we're kind of wrapping up of how to do this because a lot of times people are like, okay, I understand it, Jason, but how do I do it? Right.
Exactly.
Well, you can put some processes in place to reduce the bias, right? And again, we've talked about biases a lot here before, right? And the fewer people making the decision, it increases the level of biasness because we are all biased in one way or another, conscious or unconscious. right? And again, some of this goes back to our geopolitical, right? There's conscious and unconscious biases in the decisions that are made geopolitically. So let me just share a couple of examples. First one here is conference. So let's assume again that we go to a conference. There's 1,000 people in the room, and we're trying to figure out something about the IQ of the people in the room. And I'm only using this just because it's a fun story. Okay. And so let's say I get up in front of all the people and I say, all right, everybody, tell me, are you above or below average IQ? And the hands will go up. Everybody will vote. Now, this has actually been done scientifically before, and guess what? 80% of people believe that they're above average. That's just what it ends up being. And so, okay, now I've got some data, but I know that's not good data because I know that 80% of people can't be above average, right? 50-50, distribution. So I can say, okay, well, I know that the data isn't maybe the best. I'm going to try to add something to it so my qualitative discussion or data ends up being better. And so I get up in front of everybody and I say, okay, just because you're above or below average, which, an average, I draw a bell curve and I show people, average is the mean, average in the middle. But hey, one standard deviation is 68% of people, which fall in this narrow band, right? And 68% of the people, it's not, if you're down here, it doesn't mean you're stupid. If you're up here, it doesn't mean you're a genius, but most people are in here, right? And then you go out one and two tails, right? And okay, this number over here, this is where, Mensa starts kicking in, and people that are 140 or above are considered geniuses, blah, 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 blah. Some examples are this, right? If you're down on this level, then you get whatever, right? And then if I go back and I ask people, it's still not going to be the right answer. But some of the people will have changed and it'll be lower than it was
Yes,
before.
it'll be closer.
That's a good thing. It'll be closer to where it really is. Now, youngest. What that means is a lot of times when you're having committee meetings, whatever, right? Let the youngest people, the people that are the most junior in your organization, the people that are newest in the organization, the people who don't have the titles, let them talk first because it allows them the opportunity to actually express some of these things that if the boss goes first and they disagree with the boss or they have a different perspective, they won't say anything. And so it's a good practice to actually have the youngest people go first. Another one here, too, is the ability to play roles, which means whether you agree with a position or not, you may get assigned in the meeting to put on a certain hat and argue for a certain position, only so that these different positions are actually considered before the decision is actually made. And so that's where the whole idea of devil's advocate comes in, where again, it's like, you know, Jason usually got to play that because I play that in real life too, which is, again, sometimes I will argue a point or bring up or ask questions, not because I necessarily believe that, but because I feel like that we need to consider different other things as well to make sure and help us
Mm.
make a better decision overall. The last one, tune your BS meter, right? And so, again, tried to keep it clean, but if you don't know what a BS meter is, it's a bull something meter, right?
I think
Anyway,
people will be able to suss that
they'll
out.
be
Yeah.
able to figure it out, right? But what that means is, again, it goes back to some of the critical thinking we talked about at the beginning. Don't just accept things for what they are, you know, stop, consider, critically think it, not necessarily be cynical, but be skeptical, uh, you know, bounce data off of it, whatever else, so that you just don't get uh, confused or buy into the rhetoric that somebody might be facing out there. So
I think
that's what
that
I got
that's
for this
great.
time. Yeah.
Man, that's great material. Thank you very much. I think that that's a great place to leave it. Jason, this has been enlightening as always. I want to thank you very much for joining us here again at Risk at Work. To all of you out there, I want to thank you for spending some time with us today, and we will see you again on the next edition of Risk at Work. Take care.